This is the Anthony John Esquire podcast, and I am AJ. This episode of the pod is going to be a short review and discussion of Sarah Isgur's relatively new book, Last Branch Standing, a potentially surprising, occasionally witty journey inside today's Supreme Court, published just recently, April 8th, 2026. Sarah closes her book with an appendix titled, Don't Go to Law School, and Other Advice for Would-Be Lawyers. In this, I agree with her entirely because if you're capable, there are better things for you to do. And while law school is awesome, it's expensive, and the practice of law leads to misery and often maladaptive ways of coping with misery. That said, the vibe of her book is the complete opposite of that. It's astute, informs, light, even refreshing. I think her book should be required reading maybe for every high schooler and certainly for every voter. Saying it's appropriate for high schoolers isn't a dig. It's just that down to earth and appropriate, even with super complicated topics. And it should be required for every voter since, as a recent Onion article put it, area man passionate defender of what he imagines the Constitution to be. Many of us have way stronger opinions about the court and its cases than our knowledge bases actually justify. While the U.S. Supreme Court isn't something that we get to vote for, plenty of us vote for state Supreme Court, and as listeners will know, that's something I both take seriously and wish my fellow citizens took seriously as well. Sarah's book presents the judiciary in such a way as to make it actually interesting, as anyone who listens to her pod advisory opinions already knows. And with her making it interesting, you can't help but read it through and become much, much better informed about the court, how it works, and its history. Before I forget my strongest critique, because the book is so fun it would be easy to forget a critique, is that in my opinion, she's just not critical enough of the justices or especially of the institution. The cynic in me says that's probably because she has some degree of proximity to the court and the justices and would like to maintain it. And that can be true, but the vibe I get from her is more like the vibe I get from my partner, also a lawyer. They somehow think that the world is a place that works, that functions. We've all been alive for about the same amount of time, so how they, as smart people, ended up as optimists is beyond me. But it is what it is. Maybe because of that positive disposition, Sarah's review of each of the justices is very positive. One might say she's channeling the unconditional positive regard of one of psychotherapy's pioneers, Carl Rogers. She discusses each of the current justices in a way that combines both their personal lives and their professional lives, and she does it with what seems like genuine affection. She does touch upon some of their scandals, particularly Kavanaugh and Thomas with their confirmation hearings, but even I came out of that with much less animosity toward Thomas than I had going in. I had no idea, for instance, of his background or how his experiences probably informed and developed his judicial perspective. Regarding Kavanaugh, who I thought even worse of, mostly because I was too busy dropping out of high school to care about the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, Sarah went so far as to essentially vouch for Kavanaugh, saying that she believes Dr. Christine Blasey Ford was assaulted, but that it wasn't by Kavanaugh. Well, I found that interesting. I can also say that in my own experience of merely interning for Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Prosser, that definitely colored my perception of Chokegate when Prosser was alleged to have choked Justice Bradley the Greater during an in-chamber argument over Act 10. I'm not sure how Sarah knows Kavanaugh, but given that he officiated at her wedding, one can safely assume they're close. And for what it's worth, while I think Kavanaugh had some bad crisis management advice from whatever PR firm was holding his hand through the confirmation hearing, leading him to come across as a dick, Sarah's character, through what we know about her, her podcast, the book, is such that I take her vouching more seriously than I might from someone else. While Isgur is a former Republican operative and member of the Federalist Society, you'd never know it unless she told you. But she does, repeatedly, with several honest disclaimers about cases she or her husband have worked on when they come up in her explanation of the court and her analysis related to it. The reason you wouldn't suspect it is because her assessment of the liberals on the court is just as affectionate as those of the conservatives. She provides an anecdote of how, for instance, she got two calls when Kagan was nominated. One asking her to lead opposition research against the nomination, and the other from the White House asking if she'd be willing to publicly speak in support of it because of her familiarity with Kagan from Harvard. She rather prudently asked her boss at the time whether she'd be fired for publicly supporting Kagan. He told her to expect consequences, but not from him. She ultimately did support Kagan because it was about Kagan's fitness for the role and not the policy outcomes Isgur would prefer. As listeners to my recent podcasts on the Wisconsin Supreme Court races will know, that resonates with me. Isgur has a unique and, to my mind, more nuanced way of assessing the justices than just the typical left to right analysis, what she calls the X axis. She also includes a Y axis, an institutional axis, with order on one end and chaos on the other. Order is being concerned with precedent and institutional credibility and consistency, whereas the chaotic inclination is that the law is what it is, and being correct is better than being consistent. She gave each of the justices a rating on each of those axes. I'll confess that I don't agree with all her ratings, but concede that she certainly knows more than I do. Not only has her career tracked more closely to the court than mine has, she's also had years of doing this sort of analysis on her podcast, whereas I'm just getting started with it. So I'm going to voice my disagreement with her in a couple of places, but with the humility to acknowledge that she's got a lot more information and experience here than I do. Sarah also reworks the typical left-right grouping of the justices by describing a much more nuanced 3-3-3 group, and she uses her axes to explain where they fall. She calls them, and this would fall into the occasionally witty part of the title, the deciders, the conservative honey badgers, and the lonely liberals. You wouldn't intuitively know who those are. Maybe the liberals, actually, that's obvious. But she includes in the deciders Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. And in the conservative honey badger group, she has Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch, which of course leaves the lonely liberals, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson. So on the x-axis, 1 is the most liberal and 10 is the most conservative. And on the y-axis, 1 is the most chaotic and 10 is the most ordered. I won't go over all of the ratings, but for a sample, Roberts is a 6 conservative, 10 institutionalist. Kavanaugh is an 8 conservative, 9 institutionalist. Jackson is a 2 liberal, 1 institutionalist, making her, for example, the exact opposite of Kavanaugh. So while I don't necessarily agree with all of Isgur's characterizations, I'm playing in her sandbox, so here are a few things that I find when I sift. First, the numbers roughly balance each other out. A score of 90 would be a fully conservative court, and the aggregate is 54, so the court is about 60% on its way to complete conservatism, and that seems about right. On the institutional axis, it's essentially evenly divided at 49 out of 90, so that also tracks. Obviously, as a liberal, I can point to lots of decisions I think would justify a conservative rating. Dobbs being a huge one, but also 303 Creative and Students for Fair Admissions and Bruin. The institutionalist rating also tracks in that a nearly divided court is not really a stable one. Again, evident through some of the same cases, like Dobbs when it overturned decades of super precedent upon which precedent is built, or Bruin establishing a whole new standard of review different from all the other standards. Those are certainly anti-institutionalist outcomes, so that tracks too. Where I most strongly disagree with her here is with Gorsuch. She rates him as a 7 conservative, 2 institutionalist. But my disagreement with her might be because I think his concern for the institution is with the republic rather than the court. What we've seen in the tariff case particularly, and can infer from his questions on birthright citizenship, is that while he may not care much about the court's precedent and consistency, he cares a ton about the constitutional allocation of power between the branches and preserving that, which I think is his own kind of meta-institutionalism, I guess. So, in my analysis, the lens Isgur gives us is wonderful, fun, and has some explanatory power and even maybe some predictive power. Just as sociology has a few different popular lenses, conflict theory, functionalism, symbolic interactionalism, you can use each of those lenses to view what's going on. What you see through each of them is all likely true. You've just got to figure out what kind of magnification you need for a given job. Likewise, I don't think Sarah is claiming to have arrived at some sort of exclusively true lens only through which the court can be seen, so much as she's given us a lens that can really give us a more nuanced and detailed picture, especially compared with the flatter left right analysis. So, that said, she divides her book after introducing the Supreme Court members into part two, the x axis, and part three, the y axis. In my view, one of the most impressive aspects of her work is how she gives us essentially a 30,000-foot sociological view of, for example, what's happened in government regarding the filibuster and Supreme Court nominations over the past 40 years or so. I've tried to do the same thing sociologically from like a geostationary orbit satellite view when we're looking at the evolution of the church over 2 millennia. But hers is all the more impressive exactly because the history she's looking at is so much more recent and so much more difficult because of that. I won't try to repeat her whole assessment here. It's worth buying the book just for that alone. I will note, though, that this, the most impressive aspect of the book, was also where I heard the echo of my only real criticism of it. Her channeling of this sort of Rogerian unconditional positive regard leads to a retelling of recent history that sanitizes her own party a bit too much as it puts the overturning of Roe versus Wade at the feet of the Democrats. She describes the back and forth tennis match of the Dems filibustering Bork to the Republicans refusing to consider Garland to Gorsuch and Barrett being pushed through, all without addressing the glaring hypocrisy of the Republicans in the Garland to Barrett situations. The Dems, even in her own accounting, were at least explicit in their opposition to Bork, anticipating that his nomination would result in the overturning of Roe and prohibiting the teaching of evolution and a whole bunch of stuff that was frankly not inconsistent with his voluminous record. Her positive regard, her neutrality, does something specific that deserves notice. It flattens out the difference between escalating and lying about why you're escalating. McConnell didn't just block Garland. He stated an explicit principle for his justification. Election year nominees don't get confirmed. He said this clearly and publicly. Yeah, he carefully included caveats arising in an election year and where there is a divided government and that it had happened last in 1888, things that Sarah omits probably for brevity and clarity, but we know that his technical distinctions were buried rather than stressed. And we know that the Garland nomination's anomalous historical situation wasn't the point that he was actually speaking about. Because when the same practical situation arose, and the only difference was that they had all the power, he did exactly what he condemned the other side for. He pushed a nomination through in an election year. And that's not a structural observation, it's a moral one. And it's specifically about the relationship between stated reasons and actual reasons, which is a category her Rogerian positive regard just doesn't have room for. I'm not suggesting that Isgur is being disingenuous. She's too careful about disclosing her biases and showing her work for that. She's been way too critical of the Trump administration, particularly to be carrying water for the party that's been carrying water for him. Sarah's only call out of McConnell is that his rationale was factually accurate, but not statistically significant. And she doesn't address the hypocrisy inherent in Barrett's confirmation at all. I think we can infer from her treatment of it that she likely believes it was hypocrisy, but for her to not call it out and paint a picture that's a little too generous to her own stated side isn't her propagandizing for the party she belongs to. It's just a weakness of the Rogerian unconditional positive regard approach. But let me close out that particular critique with this. If it helps her sell more of this book, I'm all for it. There are no shortage of pundits out here to pounce on partisan perspectives. And getting bogged down in the nuances of a partisan debate, even if one side is clearly behaving worse in a particular instance, just wouldn't be worth it. Again, parts like this are the very best thing about the book. The 30,000-foot view contextualizing the interplay of the three branches from Bork to Barrett is invaluable. Her lack of blaminess for it, while she accounts for the actions of both sides, makes it appropriate for inclusion in a textbook no matter what state you're in. And frankly, maybe Rogerian unconditional positive regard is the kind of couples therapy we need as a country right now. Aside from her view of the justices, both personally and in their jobs, she makes their judicial philosophies entirely understandable and approachable in a way that's likely more useful and more accurate than, for instance, the Con Law Supreme Court seminar I took my 3L year. In that seminar, we read each of the cases before the court that term and took turns acting as the court or counsel for oral arguments in front of the rest of the class. From Sarah's discussions about the history of the court through her positioning of the judges on the XY axes and everything in between, I would say that this book added more to my knowledge base than that seminar did. Aside from their philosophies, she addresses things like standards of review in a way that I find myself envying for its clarity and precision. She also addresses, without pretending to know how to answer, the difficulties and questions posed by running the branch that the Constitution says the least about and which has the final word on the Constitution, about the doctrines that the court employs and how they're essentially just made up, but that they're made up out of necessity. And she does a great job of examining the interplay of all those factors, judicial philosophy with standards of review and with judicially created doctrine. She comes down at the end of it with a series of concrete suggestions for reforming or revising the court in light of all the difficulties that we've had with it. I think that those ideas might be too optimistic, but certainly we wouldn't be worse off for exploring them. Even as a lawyer who's practiced for almost 20 years, doing primarily appellate work, I came away from her book, appendix and all, feeling somewhat refreshed regarding a legal world that I'm pretty often cynical about. Sarah's delivery and humor is wonderful. I listened to the whole thing read by her in just a couple of days. She's got a voice you just don't get tired of listening to. While she jokingly referred to it as a page turner, I actually thought it was. Not out of suspense, but just because she's so informed and engaging and translates all of it in a way that's fun and funny and easy to understand, even when talking about hard things. I also bought a print copy of it because I fully anticipate using it as a resource. Her explanations not only of the sociological approach that I described, but also her insights on the ever-transforming meaning of what it looks like to be a Democrat or Republican or liberal or conservative, the clean, clear articulation of standards of review. It's just stuff that I know I'm going to want to come back to for a variety of reasons. So I don't want my first book report on this pod to be too glowing or ass-kissy, but I would give it full marks. Any deficiency in it originates from her fundamental optimism, which isn't something I can fairly mark against. Although I am tempted to dock half a star for her pronunciation of the T in the word often. Sarah, you're welcome to come on my podcast and nerd duel about that topic anytime. This has been the Anthony John Esquire podcast. I'm AJ, and we'll see you next time.